And I think we use English. That will be easier for you?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. And I want to take this opportunity first to congratulate you for 40 years is not a short time. And here you are today, 40 years later. But before we talk even about that journey, why is this day so important for you first?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. 40 years is not a short time, but it can also be short, depending on what the issue is. But for me personally, this is quite a journey. And I feel grateful to God for the opportunity of being alive and witnessing with my sisters and brothers this celebration. So it has meant a lot for me.
Yeah. Can you for a moment tell us about the journey 40 years later? Were you the first? Can we get that right? The first one or among the first one?
The first.
The first one.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how that, what that means for you, being the first woman minister, for that matter, in the church of PCEA, and how the journey has been for the last 40 years?
Well, I accepted God's call, and it happened that I happened to be the first. So that was not my choice. I believe that was God's doing. It has been an interesting journey. I had a lot of support from my family, my parents, and my 7 sisters. They all believed in me when I said I wanted to follow my father's footsteps. And so because I had a very strong support from home, and even when I went to the local congregation to tell the elders that I was interested in training to be ordained, I think many of them were not surprised, and they gave me their support. So I moved on from one stage of the process, from the local congregation to the parish, to the presbytery, to the training and the interviewing panel. And I would say that was just God's doing, because there could have been obstacles on the way. But I ended up being admitted to study. What I would like the audience also to know is that I was very young.
How young were you then?
I was only 21 years old. And so joining St. Paul's and finding maturer men who are already students. In my class, it was the first Bachelor of Divinity class, and majority of the students, we were 13, and I bet most of them were married, already ordained in various churches, and there I was, the young woman joining this unique group. But I must also say that the 12 men treated me with respect. Yes.
40 years later, since then, how has the journey been? I mean, what have you learned, and how do you rate the involvement of the woman clergy in the church nowadays? We call the clergy women in the church nowadays. How do you rate that?
Out of the 40 years, I have spent 30 years in the ecumenical ministry in Geneva, Switzerland. So when I talk about women in church ministry, and especially the ordained ministry, I have a wider perspective globally, and I have encountered very many women, many who had been pioneers like myself, and so we have compared notes, and some of the practical challenges that we have faced in ministry have been faced by women in other contexts all over the world. But again, it has also been very empowering for me to encounter these women and see what they have been able to achieve, the breakthroughs, the transformation that has happened in many churches. And we were started by the Church of Scotland, and we were ahead of the Church of Scotland in the discussions about ordination of women. So it didn't matter whether these women were coming from the global north or global south, because the Spirit of God moves in different ways, and the impact has been wonderful. The times I was a theological student in the United States, I also learned a lot of things. And again, I met women, mostly white women, who are ordained, and I also learned from them with their achievements. I'm one person who likes to dwell a lot on the positives without ignoring the challenges. And so I have been able to study, to research, and discover not just the women in the Presbyterian Church in Kenya, whom I was talking about this morning, but all over the world. And that has been very helpful. I have worked very closely with women theologians who are not ordained, quite a number of them because they chose not to be ordained, but to be theologically trained. And that's something that we need to keep on insisting, that even if you're not going to be ordained, being theologically trained brings a lot of added value in the work of the church in general. Yes.
One of the issues the subject matter in this symposium has been women and church leadership. Women, clergy, and church leadership and development. What is your take on how women, especially in the Church of PCEA, I heard you speak so passionately about one day, wanting to see a woman moderator, for that matter, in that top leadership. What do you think, through the years, is the church headed there, is the PCEA church headed towards now, having a woman in that top leadership?
It would take both men and women to make it happen. Let's take the example of the President Obama. He was not elected only by the black people. That population could not have put him in the White House. It needed people from all different cultural backgrounds to support his candidacy. And it's the same thing in the church. You can't have women only to struggle to get into those places. The men need to change, the patriarchal ways need to be challenged, and for men to accept that the Holy Spirit transforms each one of us. So it is not just for us women to always be the ones to kind of be struggling to get there. We also need our brothers to journey with us. And as we were exploring this morning, the women who are demanding for inclusion and equality in the church, if they did not have the men to support them, the men who are in leadership, it wouldn't have happened because they didn't have a vote. And the moment they were given the voice on the floor, the vote carried on, and it was a positive experience. So when it comes to PCEA considering women for leadership, it has done so at the level of the presbytery. The late Alfama Kenyua was one of the women who are presbytery moderators. So those kind of achievements should not be overlooked because it is step by step. We are not going to get there. You can't be the moderator of the General Assembly if there are no experiences of women through the presbyteries or even through the regional groupings that are there in the church for them to be the leaders in those contexts. So I would encourage my sisters not to shy away from taking the challenge, but I'm also challenging the men, our colleagues, both men elders and clergy, because when these votes come, it takes the elder and the clergy to do the voting. And because we have majority of the men in the General Assembly, we should expect them to support us when these positions come up. But I must insist, it has to be women who are qualified. And I think the most important thing we need to remember is that the women in the 60s who are demanding for the ordination of women elders and women clergy, they were insisting that these women must be qualified just like the men. They did not want tokenism. They did not want it to be just picked because they have demonstrated leadership. They needed to be tested. They needed to be trained just like the men. And that was what they shared with me when I was doing interviews in the late 80s, that they did not want just to be picked. They wanted to be tested, tried, and trained to be clergy.
Along the competence lines, of course.
Yes. That's what they were demanding. They did not want to be just because they are women and we don't. And again, I think if we look critically in society, we have a lot of qualified women, even to be president of this country, many. So I think we should not shy away from believing, and from a Christian perspective, as I was saying this morning, Jesus was there all the way affirming women. And when there were distractions, he never shied away to tell the men, no, women too can serve me.
Sure.
And so I think that in the church, that's where we should be taking our cue. Not what Paul said, it's what Jesus said and did. The most important thing is that he did not just say it, but he did it in action by accepting the women.
40 years now. What about the next 40 years, even as we conclude?
Oh, I wish the youngest ordained woman in PCEA would be here to answer that question, because I'm now beginning to enjoy my retirement, and to see how the women who have come after us are going to pave the next 20 years. I look at pioneering as a generation. So even though I was the first, I consider the women who are ordained, at least the first 15 years, as a generation of pioneers. And now we are heading over to the generation that is coming by ordination, because some of them are older women, but being ordained. And I would say the future is bright, but the climbing is not going to be that easy, because there are still very many obstacles. And we believe in families. We believe in the gift of bearing children, and the woman take the heaviest load of carrying the baby, nursing that baby when the baby is very young. We should not overlook those things, but we should not make them obstacles for women to be in ministry. The ministry should be shaped in a way that women are allowed to be themselves in ministry. And this is something I discovered when I was very young in ministry. I had a young family, and I finally discovered I could not take my father as the role model. I actually ended up taking my mother as the role model. She was not clergy, she was a midwife, she was a community leader, she was a church leader, and she had raised 9 children with my father, and I had to look up to how she navigated the spaces. And she was very kind to us when we were a new couple. She wrote a letter to say, you may be pioneering in this ministry, but we were also pioneers in this community. They got married as 2 professionals. My father was a teacher, she was a midwife, and they agreed to continue with their professional duties and support each other. Even when my father became clergy, she had to adjust, and it was not easy in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s to be in ministry or even to be a midwife. She was a visiting midwife for 20 years. She would be called. But after 20 years, she built a clinic at home, and the women came home. So you adjust accordingly, you support each other. So my mother wrote to us and said, we had a partnership. It was not perfect, but it was a partnership in ministry and in life, in marriage. And I think these are things that we need really to interrogate, because I think that's where we are having a lot of difficulties, not to see women in their own right as God's children, with full capacities, with full gifts, sometimes better than men. And there are many cases where I will let my husband take the lead. And there are many places where he lets me take the lead, because we know each other and we understand each other's strengths, and we build on the strengths so that we can build